We carry our experiences with us. We are a living embodiment of our history, and our bodies shape themselves based upon everything we've encountered before this. Every line on our face, every callus on our hands tells the story of who we are and where we've come from. And I've been thinking about this a lot. I've been thinking about the ways in which our memory shapes us, and about how we carry these memories physically, mentally, and metaphorically, and how that changes us over time. And I keep coming back to two questions that, if we ask them of ourselves, we can better grow. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about those questions today and explore them with you further. We judge people based upon their appearances, but I'm not talking about clothing. I'm not talking about haircuts. We judge people based upon the lines that we see on their face. And this is kind of an unconscious judgment. We can recognize subconsciously which lines people have that correspond with smiling. We can see where people's faces are worn in a pattern of a frown, and we respond accordingly. And I think our memories, our histories, are kind of like that. They're worn into us, but we don't always notice them, yet they shape the way that we respond anyway. An accumulated knowledge that doesn't necessarily correspond with any one particular event, but it's there. And so, given the role of experience, given the way in which our history shapes who we are and how we act, it leads me to the first question. The first question we can ask ourselves is, what am I experiencing? This is a good question for us to ask ourselves, especially in the era that we live in. So much that we encounter is from an algorithm, from social media, from other people telling us what we should encounter. It's fed to us, it's curated to draw us in. But it's not necessarily curated, it's not necessarily put in front of us to help us grow. And each of us will change, each of us will grow based upon what we encounter. But if we only let the algorithm shape us and change us, then I don't think we're going to grow in the direction we'd like. And to take time and think about, what am I experiencing, helps us get a little bit closer, helps us to grow in the direction we'd like to, and to bring us a little bit closer to our values, to our virtues, to the ways of being that we'd like to exhibit, to experience, to represent in the world. And I first started thinking about this idea when I encountered a really huge redwood tree. Just standing near it, feeling its size and its age, gave me an experience of peace. And I began to think about the ways in which I bring peace into my life, which I do. But for me, to become an ever more peaceful person, I can realize that part of that change, part of growing toward that peace, does require seeking out peace. I've started thinking about the ways in which we save stuff. And if you're like me, you accumulate a lot of things in your life. For me, it's rocks and sticks, drawings, pictures, things that remind me of an experience or a time. I think of it almost like souvenirs of living, souvenirs of life, not just from like an amusement park or something like that, but little things that stand out as representations of the ways we want to be. Representations of maybe moments that we felt something, that when we hold that object in our hands, when we look at that picture, it calls up that memory of that place, of that feeling, of whatever was important to us in that particular moment. And just for a moment, when you hold that rock or when you look at that picture, you're able to recall that feeling or that experience of that moment. And it's like experiencing it again. I once picked up a stone on the north coast of California, kind of a cold, desolate beach with just a few rocks on it, and I happened to find one that was really beautiful. I've carried this rock for a long time, and at one point I gave it to a friend to carry for a while, and after a couple months they gave it back to me. And I experienced the most interesting thing, that when I felt that rock, when I held on to it, not only did I experience and remember and relive that early memory, that day when I first found it, but I also would think of my friend. And so it became even more rich, even more powerful. And I started to notice those connections between these things that we save and our experiences that we encountered when we found them. And that brings me to the second question that I'd like to ask. And the second question is like the first a little bit. What the second question is, am I paying attention? It's a simple question, but I think it's an important one for us to encounter, given the current era that we live in. Because so often we're distracted. We're carrying phones that buzz in our pockets all the time. We're looking at our phones or looking at screens instead of the world around us. And just as human beings, we're hurrying from one thing to the next, never taking time to slow down and notice exactly where we're at. What am I experiencing? Am I paying attention? These two questions are inseparable. They go together, but they're important for us to ask. Because to experience trees in search of peace, to experience a stone, neither of those is enough. It's not just enough to experience those objects or those circumstances. Because change comes from attention to experience. We wouldn't change if we don't actually notice what we're encountering in those moments. To find that tree and experience the peace of it, to pay attention to the peace that we encounter so that it's less likely to fade, so that when we're not there, so that when we're living our life and hoping for that feeling or that value or that virtue, we can carry it with us. We can keep it closer because we know exactly how it feels, what the experience was like. It becomes a little bit more of who you are, because without attention, the lesson is lost. We don't quite remember the tree, or we don't quite remember the stone. And all we have is a representation of it in our mind or in the object that we carry. And with attention to our experience, we can grow closer to the ways we wish to be. So today, you might think about finding the experience you seek. You might think about paying attention. And notice how attention to these experiences begins to shape you, to change who you are. And if you see something that represents the qualities in your heart, hold it and remember exactly what it stands for.